just by way of introduction here, what is this about you snorting some kind of crazy jungle drug out of a monkey bone? What's that all about?
Here is said monkey bone right here.
There's took the monkey bone?
Well, part of it. So when we were in the Amazon, we went there to look for this extinct crocodilian or believed extinct crocodilian, the Rio Apaporis caiman. And in order to do that, we had to go like way up this tributary where nobody went, not the local hunters, nobody. And so when we told the village shaman, who we had, or he's the elder really, but he was also the shaman, what we had to do and where we had to go, he was like, oh, very dangerous, somebody's going to die. And we're like, oh, great. And he's like, well, if you want to go there, you need to be blessed, and make sure that everybody's okay. And so we're, being respectful, of course, we were like, yeah, well, no problem, whatever we need to do. And so he had this mixed up green powder. I have no idea what was in it. I'm sure there was coca.
Still, you don't know?
Oh, no clue. To this day, I don't think I ever will. But I'm sure there was like coca leaf and a bunch of jungle herbs and spices. And he brought it out in this thing, which if you're listening, you can see it. But it's a snail shell, and this is beeswax, and this is the monkey bone that it goes into. And then he would take this out.
It's like a bar. It's like a little tiny like weed pipe, but made out of completely natural materials and with a giant bowl on the end in the form of a shell.
And way cooler.
It's a pipe. It's way cooler.
He brought out this thing and like put some powder in his hand and then took this long monkey bone and blew it up everybody's noses. And everybody was like, oh, it feels like crazy. Like I remember my sound guy, Trevor, who was next to me, was like, oh man, it feels like you got chlorine on your brain. And I was like, awesome, can't wait for this. And so I was really nervous because I don't do a lot of drugs. I don't take a lot of stuff. So I was very, very nervous, like way more nervous dealing with that than I am catching the crocodiles in question. And so I get the stuff blown up my nose and I immediately go into this like and to be respectful, I was like, yep, other side. So he like does both sides of both nostrils. And I immediately fell down into the fetal position and just started puking my brains out. And what was interesting about that whole thing was the shaman was like, yep, this is the guy who would have died. Like he's been cleansed of the evil spirits now.
Oh, wow.
So, well, I don't typically believe in those things, a lot. It was pretty interesting because I'm the guy who does the hands-on stuff. I'm the guy who has to catch the things. And he's like, you're the guy who was going to die if we hadn't done this.
Right. And he didn't necessarily know that. I also don't believe in that stuff. I mean, this is a science podcast for the most part, right? An education show. But also interesting that he might not have. I assume the shaman wasn't up to speed on the role of everybody in your production
Certainly
crew.
Not.
So
certainly not.
Him picking you as the guy who was going to die and you indeed being the most likely to bite the bullet or kick the bucket in a situation that you're going into is a funny coincidence. And it does sound like a really disgusting sort of drug that they do out there, not for fun, right? It's like it's like ayahuasca type stuff. Not that you had hallucinations or anything, but when you talk about ayahuasca with people who live in the jungle in the Amazon, they're never like, oh yeah, it's great. It's like you see your dead brother and you cry for 3 days and you're puking like projectile vomiting.
Totally.
Like it's medicine. It's
exactly.
like chemo.
And this was not something that was done on the regular. You know what I mean? This was just like, hey, you need to be cleansed and protected if you're going up this dangerous tributary. And so this was like a special thing that we were, really required to do, quite frankly. And yeah, no, it's like medicine. It's funny because I never understand it, I'm probably going to offend some people here, but I never understand the like, the basic white chick who's like, I'm going to go to South America and do ayahuasca. It's like, good for you, but like nobody enjoys this. Like this is part of their tradition and their culture that they do as a cleansing, and it's like, it's nothing to do with us. I don't know. I feel very, very strange about, like, I've never really understood that like drug tourism type thing where you go there and implant for a day and pretend like you're one of the culture by, doing a bunch of mind altering drugs, and then coming back and being like, oh my God, it changed my life. It's like, well, did it? Because you're back to doing the same crap you always do. Right. So I don't know. I've never really understood that, but this was not that. This was something that we were just sort of, like I say, kind of forced to do.
Yeah, I think the drug tourism thing is interesting, and it's probably a whole different show with a whole different discussion. But I almost resent myself for saying this. I think a lot of people are missing meaning in their life, so they search things out like that are supposedly like life, deeper experiences. It's basically an edgier, more adult version of going skydiving. You ever go skydiving in high school? I couldn't afford it, but a lot of my friends did, right? So they would go skydiving and they're like, it's amazing. You really feel connected and alive. And I'm like, okay. And this is just another trendy version of doing that same thing for most people who spend $8,000 to go to Costa Rica for a week and do ayahuasca with a shaman who was a stockbroker 3 months ago.
Exactly right. Very well articulated. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's people searching for some kind of connection or meaning because they don't get it in their daily lives.
Right. And they'll cry and have an emotional outburst about their cousin who died in the 90s. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but like they probably never feel much of anything because they spend their life commuting to and from an office and stopping by Starbucks on the way home. And they're, a lot of the people that I know that are doing it, they don't have kids yet. They're not necessarily in a stable relationship yet. Not everybody by any stretch, but there're just a lot of people who are kind of like floating in their early 30s. When in that part of my life, I was like, what am I doing? Totally. What is the point? What do I need to be doing? Am I living? Is this life worth living? The one that I'm living now? And so ayahuasca would be like, hey, want to find that out next week? Go ahead. Here's your credit card form.
And you're comparing yourself to your peers, right? Oh, so and so is married and has kids, and they have purpose and they have meaning and they have a good career.
Right.
This is my story. Like, I'm going to go down there and do this thing, and I can tell everybody about my spiritual journey and so on and so forth, right? And it's, I don't know. Yeah. I think it to me, it has like the opposite effect. Like, I almost feel like good for you for at least like taking the initiative to go do something. But at the same time, it's like, I look at those people that talk about doing those kind of things as even like more basic in a way. It's like, it's like, come on, like, do you really need this? This is like a false thing. It's like, go do something that's actually meaningful. And for me, that's like, go and volunteer with like GVI or one of these projects where you can do citizen science and like make a difference. Don't go do another selfish thing, which is what this really is,
That's interesting. Yeah, I was going to say, go volunteer at an orphanage in Guatemala for 2 weeks and see how that changes your life as opposed to just doing drugs for 4 days. But anyway, like I said, probably a different conversation for a different podcast. Tell me about growing up in Zimbabwe. First of all, you don't have an accent. Did you just get rid of it?
Yeah, so when I moved to the States when I was 14, which is right on the cusp of when you keep it and when you don't. And I do say, like, I'll never be able to say can't, like Americans say can't, I say can't, like a soft A. So I have a couple words that have just stuck. But truth be told, when I moved here, I was so, like, not embarrassed, but like annoyed. Like, people were always coming up to me and asking me, and I was trying to fit in, and I really didn't fit in. I wrote about that in my book, but I just really didn't fit in with my peers. So I did everything I could to like intentionally hide my accent and start talking like an American. And I regret that in my later life because now this is my natural speaking voice. And, I regret that I sort of squashed my own heritage in an attempt to fit in as a teenager.
I think a lot of people do that, but I will say, at least a high single-digit percentage, possibly double-digit percentage of a guy like Steve Irwin's charm was the fact that he'd go, whoa, crikey.
Yeah, totally,
look at
totally.
It, right? And it's like, oh, man, you don't want to get rid of that, right? It's different if you say, wow, look at this big alligator. It's different, right?
It is. And I don't really care about it from the like showmanship standpoint. I just care about it because it's my heritage. And I don't, of course. Whatever. Like, and I agree. I think, we always joke with our friend group. We're always like, we wish we had an Australian friend to just say ridiculous things all the time because all the time. It's just like everything they say is hilarious. So, but yeah, I just sort of wish I hadn't squashed that little piece of my heritage.
So you grew up on a farm, but it's not a farm like Americans think of a farm. This is, and I'm sorry for using this word. This is like a giant plantation style. I mean, it's huge, hundreds of workers right on this farm.
We had 200 workers on our farm. Yeah.
And is plantation always sort of racist, a racist farm? I don't know.
It definitely sounds like it when you say the word plantation, and that's not even a word that we ever had in Zimbabwe where I grew up. So maybe
I should just not use that word again.
You use it, man. I don't care, but I certainly didn't grow up on a plantation. That to me has a whole different sort of look and feel.
Now that I say it out loud, it's not exactly what I meant.
Sounds brutal.
You had but it does come into play later. Yeah, huge amounts of workers. Like this is almost like an industrial size operation, right?
Yeah, well, it was certainly industrial. I mean, Zimbabwe was one of the greatest farming nations in the world before, Mugabe basically collapsed that. And so we grew up on a tiny farm by Zimbabwean standards, minute, 200 acres, right, which is minute by Zimbabwean standards. And we did high-end Alstroemeria flowers for the export market. That was what we farmed primarily, which is a very beautiful, flower, ornamental flower. But for instance, our neighbors directly like bordering our fence had nearly 1 million acres, and they were one of the largest tobacco producers in the world, and they had tens of thousands of employees. So we were small and high end, and there were a lot of big and very industrial farms in our area. But yeah, grew up on a farm, 200 acres, like I say, tiny by African standards, pretty huge by American standards. But we ran around barefoot all the time. If I wasn't in school, I used to hang out. Like all of my best friends were the people that worked on our farm's children. So I'd hang out with them. We'd be barefoot. I spoke Shona fluently. They spoke English pretty well. I'd sleep on the floor of their mud hut. They'd come and sleep up in my house. We'd go to the dam fishing together or run around playing soccer together. And that was my whole childhood on the farm. And outside of that, I was in the bush because my family ran safari businesses.
So you were kind of. Were you sort of what's the word? What's the opposite of urban? You were like an outdoor kid, even among other outdoor kids, right? Because you grew up on the farm and hunt, trap, fish, whatever. But then it was also like, yeah, and our job is to go even into the jungle and do more jungly things and more outdoorsy things.
So in Zimbabwe, we have a term for the opposite of what we were called townies, which means you live in town, like you wear shoes every day, you don't go into the bush. And we were the opposite of townies. We were farm boys. Yeah. So, like grew up on the farm. Very feral, very feral. I distinctly remember putting shoes on my feet for the first time. I was the day I went to school, my first school day, age 6. It was the first time I was ever made to actually wear shoes. And I was like, I remember just being like, these are so hot. Like, how can people put these things on their feet? So yeah, no, we were real farm boys. Grew up, everything was sticks and bashing and guns and fishing and fighting and just what little boys do out on the farm. And I had a little sister and she had her group of friends, but we were just we were farmers and that's how we grew up. And when we weren't doing that, we had a little bush plane on the farm and my mom would run safaris, so we'd take people into the bush much further out than the farm in places like Monopools, Victoria Falls, and the list goes on, and go on safari to see the wildlife, photographic safaris.
It seems like a lot of the stuff, maybe even most of the stuff you did as a kid just easily could have gotten you killed. I mean, in the book, you're talking about trapping hyenas, dangerous elephants, dangerous fish, which is even more scary somehow. And people think like, oh, Australian animals are really dangerous, but it's nothing compared to Africa. Like,
I hate that. I hate that, Jordan. It pisses me off so much because everybody's like, oh, especially the Aussies, right? And I play rugby with a bunch of Australians, and they're like, yeah, no is more dangerous than Australia, mate. And I'm like, bro, you have like a couple spiders. Like, relax. Try go to Africa where everything can eat you. Like, it's not even close. Like, it's way worse in Africa. And anyway, so yeah, growing up, look, I had quite a few near-death encounters, but I'll say this. Life is a lot cheaper in Africa. It's looked at very differently. Kids are a lot more wild. People are a lot more wild in general. All this like safety protocol that we're all used to living here in the United States doesn't exist. There's none of that. You want to wear a seatbelt, wear a seatbelt. You want to sit on the hood of the car on the freeway, sit on the hood of the car on the freeway. Nobody cares. It just, those kind of things don't exist. So you have to make your own choices about what's safe and what isn't, as opposed to being told what's safe and what isn't and what you can and cannot do. And we made a lot of bad choices. And, I'll forever have a pretty bum arm because of it and a lot of scars because of it. So, we made a lot of bad choices, but that's just what kids do over there.
Yeah. I mean, look, to be fair, Australia has crazy like saltwater crocs and stuff that can come out of the water and grab you. But it seems like in Africa, you are firmly just in the middle of the food chain, period.
Yeah. Once you get into the bush, for sure. Like if you're in Australia and you're in the outback, you're still at the top of the food chain. Nothing's coming to eat you. There are things that can bite. I mean, except for salties, I guess. But, outside of that, you're very much so at the top of the food chain. In Africa, you're like 4 steps below the top of the food chain. There are many big cats that can eat you. There are many scavengers. There are much more dangerous things than the big cats like hippos and Cape buffalo. And and elephants that can trample you. And so, yeah, no, and that's an amazing thing. And I miss that a lot. And it's one of the reasons I'm heading to Africa next week. Thank goodness. I can't wait. But it's one of the things I miss so much being here, is not being connected to the environment and being in the food chain and learning respect for animals that are above you in the trophic cascade, which it's not really something that we get here in the United States. We've sort of tamed the environment too much.
Tell me about the Zimbabwe land reform and what happened, because I think people have kind of maybe sort of heard about this. I did an episode with a guy, Bradley Stein, friend of mine from South Africa, episode 760. This is not Zimbabwe. Obviously, South Africa is, of course, different. But his brother-in-law was he was murdered by these guys that just came in and were like, we want your land. We're just going to kill you. And that was it.
All our neighbors were murdered. I saw a guy get shot. Like, we went through a lot of that. So in the early 2000s, starting in about the year 2000, Zimbabwe went through this land reform process. And what it was, to sum it up as eloquently and briefly as I can, was the president, self-elected president for life, Robert Mugabe, had basically he was losing grip, and he needed a means by which to continue to control power and a means by which to continue to be a martyr at the head of it, and he was a dictator, regardless of what you may or may not read about democracy in Zimbabwe. And so in the early 2000s, keep in mind, all of Southern Africa has a history of racism and turmoil, right? It just does. There's no blanketing it or pretending otherwise. And so in the early 2000s, when things were very good and Zimbabwe was affluent and had lots of money, and in some instances we were richer than the United States because we were 1-to-1 with the British pound, which was stronger than the US dollar, So if you think about that, our economy was incredible. But as Robert Mugabe felt things slipping, his method in which to control people and contain power was to blame all of the white farmers and landowners, and basically say, if you were white and you owned a big farm, you were the problem because you were taking money from local people and things like that.
Right.
Even though families like mine, who had been in Zimbabwe for 6 generations, like, we couldn't have been, we were more Zimbabwean than most people are in America, Americans, right?
Oh, yeah, easily.
6th generation, yeah. And so, my family my parents were born on a farm, and their parents were born on a farm, and I was born on a farm, and, that was just sort of all we knew. And anyway, during this time, Robert Mugabe announced that basically, quote unquote, war veterans from the Zimbabwe Rhodesia Independence War could go in and take land as they pleased, and there would be no ramifications. And so what ended up happening is you ended up with a bunch of 14-year-olds who had never seen a war in their life from the city getting their hands on AK-47s and aggressive weaponry that were handed through the military and through the ZANU-PF political power to these young, ambitious kids who didn't know any better from the city and from the streets, who would then go out and take things for themselves. And so, and if you didn't vote for Robert Mugabe's political party, which was ZANU-PF, you didn't outright say that you were voting for him and a part of his party, then you would be indoctrinated through torture, through these things called punguis, where they'd put nails in your feet and burn your skin and all these different things. And so, as you can imagine, these are hard people that I'm talking about, like the Zimbabwean farmers. They grew up on farms. They've spent their whole life dealing with wildlife. They've been through several wars. So most of the farmers, like all the farms surrounding us and the one I mentioned earlier in our chat, dug their heels in and said, "Bring it on,"
Mm-hmm.
And
it's like The Purge. I'm not even all jokes aside. This is the movie The Purge, where this is like, okay, come get my from my cold dead hands, and I assume they just armed up, and they were like, cross this fence, and I'm going to kill as many of you until you get to the house.
Exactly right, and that happened a lot,
Damn.
not like a little bit. And I mean, we got chased home, we got shot at. I remember one day coming back from school and just hearing something as my mom was ripping down driving, and there was a bullet hole through the back windshield and all the way through the front windshield of our Land Cruiser. Wow. Things got crazy. Our neighbors got murdered. There was lots of these punguis, and it really wasn't a black versus white thing. That's what's crazy, because most of the country wanted to support the MDC political party, which was the opposition to the ZANU-PF political party, and ZANU-PF was Robert Mugabe's political party. And the problem was ZANU-PF controlled the military. And so they had all of the firepower and all of the weaponry. And so it really had nothing to do with black versus white. That was just the catalyst to make it like that. And ultimately, people like my family and tens of thousands, if not millions more of the local Shona people suffered the most because of this indoctrination through torture, because of these armed hooligans basically coming in. And everybody that stuck their heels in basically died, to be quite honest. And everybody that fled made it. And to tell you what happened to us, I'd been pulled out of school early, came home, and my mom said, go and lock yourself in the bedroom, blah, 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 blah. And my little sister and I locked. My mom was a single mother. My dad left when we were 8. So she was a single white lady on a farm in rural Africa with 2 little kids. And so she was an easy target, right?
Yeah.
And so, my mom said, go and lock yourselves in the bedroom, blah, blah, blah. And these guys came marching up. They'd been on our fence line for a couple weeks, and they'd taken the neighboring farm, and they were camping on the fence line. And we had this big Matabele warrior who was our security guard, and he had been in shootouts with them and all kinds of things. And basically they came in one day and they said, you have 24 hours to leave, and otherwise we're going to kill you. And they had killed all of our neighbors, so they weren't joking. And I was 14 years old, full of piss and vinegar, and I grabbed a rifle off the wall and a knife and put it on my hip and started marching out there to go do justice. My mom smacked me across the face and said, go pack your bags. Yeah. And thank God she did. Yeah. And so we packed our bags, and 24 hours later, we were in the United States.
Jeez, man. Do you think you'd ever go back there? I mean, I don't even know what... Obviously, Mugabe would have to be ousted. It seems like there's no going back, right? Because have the farms been divided up, or are they just burned?
That's just all. So I've been back many times. I mean, it's still my home, really, many times. Yeah, and Robert Mugabe has since passed, but it was sort of out of the pot and into the fire. The next dictators know better.
Yeah, that's sorry, I misspoke. I mean, that regime would have to be ousted. I know he's been gone for a minute, but the government would have to change.
Yeah, and it just hasn't, to be honest. And I've even been back to my old farm, and it's just like all the trees have been cut down for firewood, all the windows have been smashed in the house, where there used to be this like very neat area where 200 people lived. The whole thing's just like squatter camps now. There's like goat crap everywhere, and like it's just all burnt to rubble. There's just nothing left standing, So as far as going back, I mean, I go back regularly, and to be clear, I don't want to paint a terrible picture. Like downtown Harare and parts of it are still really beautiful and wonderful, and while there's like no functioning economy and money's a nightmare, and we won't get into that whole thing, it's just the rural land that's just gone. It's just been totally wiped out, and that incredibly booming industry of agriculture in the country of Zimbabwe just doesn't really exist anymore. There's little pieces of it, little chunks of it, but it's just a mess.
Is Zimbabwe the country where we see those memes where there's like $1 trillion bill?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So our inflation got so bad that it wasn't the value of the money was not worth the paper that it was printed on. So when the currency actually collapsed, the Zimbabwean dollars, the street was just lined with trillions of dollars because it was so worthless. Like people were just throwing it out, because in order to buy a loaf of bread, you'd have to take like 2 suitcases of bills, because it would be 83 billion for a loaf of bread or something like that.
Oh my God.
And the highest note was a $1 million note or $1 trillion note or whatever it was. And so you'd have to take suitcases of cash in order to buy a loaf of bread, which also didn't exist because nobody had stock it. And, the whole economy just completely collapsed.
So what do you do? That you just barter? How does that even work? How do you do anything?
Well, it's very, very, very difficult. And things have changed now. A lot of bartering, a lot of services for goods, a lot of, hey, I'll give you, here's a little bit of US dollars that somehow made it in, and they're filthy and they look like you wouldn't even recognize them as US dollars because the paper notes are so old and have changed hands so many times. It's hard to explain if you've never seen it, but hey, I'll give you one of these US dollars and a bit of this chocolate that I got in exchange for 6 eggs. And, like everything's just a haggle and a negotiation. And a lot of it, before, even now, but a lot of it's like substance, living. So you grow some of your crops and you have some chickens and subsistence. That's what I mean. Sorry. And, it's just, it's just a mess. The country's just a mess. And I, for your listeners, I don't want to discourage anybody going there, because what we need is people to go there and for them to go on a phenomenal safari, which still exists, and see wildlife and bring in fresh currency and cross our fingers and hope and pray that one day the regime changes and things level off and stabilize, because it's really the instability that's the problem.
Yeah, when you go there, bring some fresh, clean dollars, and then take all the dirty, disgusting ones back with you and bring them to Chase Bank and trade them
Yeah,
in.
good
They need
luck.
fresh. They need
They
fresh
look
currency.
terrible. Yeah. But anyway, so Zimbabwe's an interesting place. And yeah, times have definitely changed from when I was a kid. But when I grew up, it was an idyllic place. You know, it was wild. It was safe. We never locked our doors ever in my entire childhood. I don't even think we had keys to our front doors.
Well, you
It
had a
was,
giant security guy and a bunch of guns, so
yeah,
you
that
probably
helped
didn't need
too.
a lock.
Yeah, that helped too. But you know, it was just an amazing, idyllic place to grow up when you're a kid. You run around wild. You've got all these wild animals, tons of space and freedom. And then yeah, it all sort of collapsed in the early 2000s.
So you end up in downtown Oakland, California, which is not. I mean, that's that's kind of a hard area.
Very hard.
It's like a Detroit-ish kind of place.
Very hard. And it was then. Now it's all gentrified and you can get yourself like a nice beeswax smoothie and whatnot.
Yeah,
But
pour over coffee. It takes 20 minutes to make.
Yeah, exactly. That's Oakland now. Oakland 2001 was a different place. And yeah, so we ended up there. And the reason we ended up there is my mom, sister, and I fled the country as political refugees. And we came to Oakland because my dad was actually an American. And, you know, while he was out of the picture, my mom knew San Francisco because that was where she had actually lived with him for a couple years in San Francisco. Yeah, before they got married. And anyway, so we fled. We came to Oakland, California, and we went from, you know, a farm in Zimbabwe with all the things I've just described to the three of us living in a one-bedroom government facility overnight on welfare as political refugees in Oakland, California. And that was hard, you know, and it was hard because here comes me in my little short, cocky shorts with my skinny legs and my button-down shirt that I'd grown up in, you know, like African bush attire, running around Oakland, you know, barefoot on the streets trying to make friends. And that didn't go very well.
I can only imagine. I mean, and also, I read in your book that you're like running around in what essentially sounds like a highway median, trying to catch snakes and
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah. We were in and out of Tilden National Park, which is amazing. Or it's not national. I think it's Tilden State Park or something like that. It's a beautiful park in the Bay Area. And, you know, and then in between that, I'm flipping over logs, like you said, in highway divides and, you know, just anywhere I could find any bit of wildlife because that was really the only thing that I knew.
It's great. What did your mom do for work? I mean, she was a safari guide. Not a whole lot of that going on in Oakland, California.
Well, no, and I don't think I've ever told this story to anybody, but the stress of the whole thing and losing the farm and losing everything, we came here $200 to our name. So that was all we had, 3 suitcases of clothes. So she actually, from the stress of it all, she had a pulmonary embolism. And so when we landed, she got rushed into urgent care in Oakland Central Hospital or whatever the hell it was called. And she spent the first 2.5, 3 weeks in the hospital on life support and having an emergency procedure. And we slept on the hospital floor for the first couple of weeks.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So it was definitely a trying time. The nice thing was, you know, nice thing being an interesting way to put it. I was 14 and my sister was 12. So it was sort of, we were very sad. I mean, I grasped it a lot more than my sister did. You know, 14, you're a real little person. But part of it was almost exciting in a way. Not that my mom was sick. That was terrible, of course. But just like, it was also different. You know, we'd never even seen a hospital like what they had in San Francisco. Things like Toys R Us didn't exist. And, you know, big streets, 5-lane highways, stoplights, you know, cities. Like, we had never seen any of this stuff. So part of it was sort of exciting. And it was just also different. It was almost like, it just wasn't really believable, I think. You know, it's like we didn't really understand what was going on. So for my sister and I, well, it was difficult, and I was getting into fistfights and starting trouble on the streets of Oakland and running around like a madman. And my little sister was sort of just shadowing me or sticking with my mom. I don't think either of us understood what was going on until a little bit later in life.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you're basically living in a sci-fi movie, right? You leave Africa and you come to the big city, and you're in this place with lights on 24/7. It's just got to be completely crazy. But she's a single mom, and she's basically a refugee and a single mom in the U.S. at the same time who's having a health crisis. I mean, it's just, you can't really, that's a lot at once.
It was a lot. Yeah, it was a lot. And it was definitely, you know, we didn't know if my mom was going to live or die. And of course she survived, which was great, but she had this pulmonary embolism moving into her lungs or her heart, I don't recall. And, you know, had this, I think it was her lungs. but yeah, I had this whole like breathing thing, and then we were sleeping on the hospital floor, and then in and out of this government housing, and I was like, I was getting in fights on the street with kids. I didn't really understand why I was fighting, because I was just like this crazy little white boy running around in like a pretty rough neighborhood. And it was a very weird time, but that didn't last very long. And as soon as my mom got out of the hospital and sort of saw what was going on, like, with me running around and coming back all beat up and stuff like that, she got us out of Oakland as quickly as possible. And we moved to the central coast of California to a little tiny surf town. Still on welfare and everything else, but you have the ability to move and do whatever you like when you're on state welfare, as long as you continue to, I don't know, do whatever is required, I suppose. But so she got us out of that town, and that got us out of a lot of trouble, or at least got me out of a lot of trouble pretty quickly, and moved us to the tiny little surf town, 2,000 people of Cayucas, California.
Wow. And but you keep your love for wildlife and animals. It seems like your first gig was counting ants, which sounds so glamorous, man. You really jumped right into the top of the profession.
Yeah, well, that's a bit of a fast forward because we settled in Cayucas for a bit. I finished up in high school. I found freediving and spearfishing, which was the only sort of wild side of California that really made me feel like one with the ecosystem like I had in Africa.
Except you're doing it with a bunch of like investment bankers and tech bros with LinkedIn stock options.
Totally. It was that, but I didn't realize that because I was 16 or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, so I found this like spearfishing, which excited me because there were white sharks and sea lions and all these things that a little boy from the landlocked country of Zimbabwe had never even heard of or seen before. So that really helped. And then I met a girl, as one does, and she was like, "Where are you going to college?" I was like, "I'm not going to college. I'm going to Africa." And she's like, "Oh, well, she didn't say this, but she's like, well, I'm really cute and I'm going to UC Santa Barbara." And I was like, "Oh shit, I better go to UC Santa Barbara." And so on the last night of applications at about 7 p.m., I started my one and only college application, which was to UC Santa Barbara. And by a miracle of that combined with the fact that I went to the school and met a professor who was impressed with my wildlife knowledge and blah, 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 long story, I got into UCSB and then had a great time, really settled in, started to understand California, make real friends, so on and so forth. And then came out of that with a biology degree and sort of my thumb up my butt going like, what the heck am I going to do next? Right. And that was when I started as a biologist, just doing all these odd jobs all over the place. And my first real one, my first proper contract was counting ants at the California Channel Islands, invasive Argentine ants.
God, that must be tedious. Like how many there's always a lot of ants. How many ants are you counting per day?
Millions.
Really?
Yeah. Well, no, I think it was like hundreds of thousands per day. But yeah, no, it's absolutely miserable. The cool part about that, when you say counting ants, and I think I write that in the book and stuff to be dramatic, but we were living at a research station on the California Channel Islands. There's island foxes everywhere. It's absolutely stunning out there. Nobody can go out there unless you're a researcher. Yes, we were slurping up ant traps and then spending all afternoon counting them, but I got to be in a very cool environment and do very interesting things while I was there doing these ant counts. So while I forget what I wrote in the book, but I'm sure I made it sound very monotonous and tedious, which it was. But at least I was outdoors and in the wild and doing the things that I love doing, because I was much happier counting ants at a research station than I would have been, counting numbers at a brokerage. So
yeah, for sure. That's a given, right? It beats spreadsheets if you're a guy in your position. I can imagine your college application, and they're like, "Oh man, this is great. He's from Africa. He grew up on a farm in Africa."
Oh,
and you show up, and they're like, "We're looking for the guy from Africa." Oh, you're that kind of from Africa.
Right. Where's the 7 foot tall mega athlete? Like, because you're not him. Yeah.
Where's the guy that's not a pasty white dude?
No, I've said this, Jordan. I've said this in jokes so many times. The only reason I got into college because I was a white African American Jew. That's it. There was like no other way I was getting into college.
You guys are Jews too? That seems unusual. Are there a lot of Jews? Were there a lot of Jews in Zimbabwe?
400 in the entire country. So no, there were not a lot of us. Yeah, no, we checked all the minority boxes.
But where did you come from then originally? Like, were you English Jews, Dutch Jews?
English Jews.
Wow. Yep. And you came to Zimbabwe. That's a very not super Jewish thing to do is go to a place where you have to do lots of manual labor.
I couldn't tell you, to be honest. And, you know, I'm not anything, to be honest, Jordan. I'm not religious at all. I don't even identify as any certain like political party or anything. Like, I'm not anything. I'm interested in critters. You know, I'm very one-track minded. But yeah, I don't even know how that heritage came about. We're, you know, English Jews by heritage, but how many generations ago or where or how or when, I don't even know the answer.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. There's actually a surprising number of Jews in Africa, but usually they're in like Cape Town and they're in merchant businesses, and that's how it happened. Usually don't see them like deep in landlocked jungly places.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show.
All right, so then you go on one of my favorite guilty pleasure shows that I haven't watched for a long time now, Naked and Afraid, which is exactly what it sounds like. For people who don't know what Naked and Afraid is, it is where they strip you down naked and they put you in the middle of a really harsh environment like a jungle or a marshland or a desert, and they're like, all right, survive for, 21 days and don't get dysentery and have to get evacuated?
Exactly right. Yep, that's it. Yeah, so I came home from one of those Channel Island contracts. I don't remember if it was ants or weeds or rats or foxes. I don't remember which one it was, but I came home, plopped down on the couch after like a 2 or 3 month contract, filthy dirty, you know, covered in, you know, because it's not like there's real showers out there or anything, right? And plopped down on the couch, all exhausted. And my girlfriend at the time, the same pretty girl who convinced me to go to university, says, have you seen this show? And I'm like, nah, this looks like nonsense. And she's like, oh, well, I've seen you do all these things. Pardon me?
It is nonsense. It's garbage. It's like 90 Day Fiance.
It's utter garbage, yeah.
You know, naked in the jungle.
Yeah, it's utter garbage. But yeah, and the producers are going to hear this and be like, how dare you say that? But I don't care. It's utter garbage.
Yeah, it's too late now.
Yeah, I don't care. It is. It's trash. But anyway, so I was like, oh, cool. This looks fun. And so I sent basically a cocky email to the production company, which is Renegade 83. And, you know, it comes up at the end of the credits. It says who made the show. And I sent a cocky email going, hey, you know, my name's Forrest. I grew up in Africa. And by the way, the people that you have on this show doing these things aren't very good at it. Here's a better way to do this. And here's a better way to do that. And, you know, long story short, 10 days later, I was on a plane to Panama to be on the next season or special or whatever it was of Naked and Afraid. And the only reason I did that was to get a vacation, because doing Naked and Afraid, doing 21 days of nude survival in the jungle seemed a lot easier than going back out to the islands and counting ants for another 3 months. So yeah, it was just something I decided to do for fun. Got through that, was very, very successful on that show. At the time, I think the highest rated survivalist they'd had, because they give you like a little score at the end, and then just went back to being a biologist. Didn't think anything of it. However, when the show came out and I saw the numbers, the ratings, there was a 4 million number rating on the show that I had been on. And I was like, holy shit, 4 million people saw me, you know, jiggling my junk on TV, on Discovery Channel. And here I am like publishing papers and doing all this scientific work and nobody's seeing it. You know, it's like a complete waste of time. Like, if I really want to make a difference in wildlife and conservation, I got to figure out how to do it like this. And so that was that exact day I called my boss, Morgan, and said, hey, Morgan, like, no offense, man. Thank you so much for the years of, you know, letting me work for you and everything else. But I'm moving on. I'm going to come up with a new way to do conservation. And that was when I made the switch to get into television.
Yeah, most people can't parlay Naked and Afraid into the fame that they hope they're going to get from being on Naked and Afraid.
No,
but you didn't do that
not.
On purpose, which is interesting, because you see those. The reason people watch this show, again, for those who don't know, is you want to see somebody who goes, yeah, I've been teaching wildlife survival for 20 years. And you want to see them crying within 48 hours because they're dehydrated and they're sunburned to the point where they can't move. It's pure schadenfreude. It's purely like, 100%. Oh, you think you're tough? Look at this person cry and now eat like an overcooked snake.
And it's funny because the people that are crying are always the hardcore military guys, you know, the like, I'm this badass. And I'm sure that's done intentionally, by the way. It's not a dig at the military. I'm sure that's done by the producers and who they cast. But I remember distinctly being on the show And one of the producers, who I will not name, but she comes up to me and goes, "Nobody's going to like you, Forrest." And I was like, "Why?" And she's like, "You're not suffering. You're not struggling. You're not letting the audience be sympathetic." She's like, nobody is going to like you." She's like, "You can't just be smiling and happy all the time." And I'm like, well, sorry, but I'm having fun. Like, I've got nothing to cry about. Like, I just didn't really get it. I'd only watched half of one episode ever going into it. So, very ill prepared, to be honest. But, yeah, I just like thought it was fun and a joke. And I just kept saying to myself, I'm like, there's no other point in history where you'd spend 21 days naked running around a jungle. Like, there just isn't. You'd self-rescue after a day or two. You'd figure out a way to get out of there. You'd get some clothes on and be like, "Oh, well, that was a weird experience." But instead, you're like forced to make it all 21 days, and the show makes it seem like you have no other option, blah, blah, blah. You could exit at any time, right? You could just hike out of there. But yeah, no, I just thought the whole thing was really fun. And like, I was dancing and singing and building all these water wells and stuffing my face with oysters. And yeah, I just had a blast. And, one of the things I did, and never made the show, but I think I've talked about it a few times, is I found like 30 pounds of these wild yucca, these like jungle potatoes.
Oh,
and
wow.
that was on like day 3. So day 3, I had this shelter. I was making ceviche, eating oysters, and I had stockpiled enough food for about 3 months. And and they were just like, the producers were pulling their hair out. They're like, "Oh my God, this fucking guy, like he's like ruining the show," because I wasn't struggling, I wasn't crying, I wasn't breaking down, I wasn't being snarky. I was just like, okay, now I'm camping. And I think that everybody thought that was going to be a disaster. And when the show came out, the audience actually loved that there was somebody who wasn't just miserable the whole time.
Right. Well, because you probably weren't being a big shit talker like all the other people who are like, "Yeah, my grandfather was Native American. He taught me how to survive." And then it's like, cut to them crying and being like, "Why is the water dirty? And a kid won't let me eat it."
Totally. Yeah. No, I never had any big emotional like ups or downs, because it just wasn't, no offense, but it just wasn't that hard. And I know a part of that is where I was located, and, my background allowed me to be successful, but I just didn't have that emotional roller coaster that people tune in to see, where they're like, "Yeah, I killed this thing," or "Oh my God, I'm breaking down, I'm so cold." Like, I was just like, this is fun. Like, I don't know. What do you want me to say? And that was a hit. And then when that show came out, like I said, I was a bit of a hit, but, hundreds, if not 1,000 plus people, probably hundreds of people have done that show and not leverage that into something else. I made the decision then and there to go into the field of, really, it was wildlife biology, because that's what I do, but more like wildlife communication, and education through media. And the other thing that's not very talked about is it took about 3 years from when that happened until something actually stuck. And that was 3 years of living on my girlfriend's part-time teacher salary, eating top ramen, saving money, writing the most terrible looking TV show pitches I've ever seen. But, looking back at it now as the owner of a production company, sold a bunch of TV shows, but, just grinding and just trying and taking no after no after no for like 3 years. And that's the part that always gets skipped over. It's like, oh, this guy went on Naked and Afraid, and, a week later he was like a famous wildlife guy on Animal Planet. Well, no, that's absolutely not how it went. It took a lot of rejection and 3 years of grinding to get there.
In your show, you chase species that are presumed extinct. Now, okay, if we say something is extinct, where do you begin looking for something that nobody else can find? They're like an animal detective, basically. I don't know if that's an oversimplification, but it seems like...
No, I think that's pretty accurate.
This doesn't exist anymore. Well, I'm going to find one. How do you even know that you can? And it's not like, no, there's really just aren't these anymore. They're gone.
Well, yes, that's one of the shows that I do or have done, Extinct or Alive. It's not going any longer. Yeah, I mean, so after Naked and Afraid came out, I had my 5 seconds of fame, as everybody does, right? Like, you have your 5 seconds of, the local newspaper wants to talk to you about what it was like to be naked in the jungle. And I just didn't really care about any of that, because I was back to work as a biologist, so on and so forth. And so what I did instead is I said, hey, how about I talk to you about like what's going on with El Nino this year in California, and the fact that we have hammerheads at the Channel Islands for the first time, and how about the, this and that and all these different wildlife stories. And so most people were just like, nope, click, and hung up the phone.
No thanks.
And a couple of them said, yeah, let's hear about it. And so that is what I basically slowly leveraged into an opportunity to be able to come up with my own idea. And so I'm answering your question in a very long-winded way, but I knew through my childhood growing up in Zimbabwe, I had found I had redefined some range distributions of species that people had not believed lived in certain areas. Even here in the state of California, I redefined the coach whip range. They said they didn't occur in Ojai, and I found 4 specimens in Ojai, and they had
What
to
is that?
republish. Oh, a beautiful pink snake, basically.
I was going to say, like, oh, how does this guy know there's one there? Well, he actually caught one with his bare hands, no shoes, and he's 14.
Yeah, 4 of them, not one of them. And so took that into the field guide. What is it? Western, I've got it here somewhere in my library. I don't know. Took that in, and they had to redefine the range distribution, right? So I had always been doing this, like, and it was a combination of a lot of things. My survival skills from Naked Afraid, my upbringing from Zimbabwe and being in the bush and being, the son of a safari business owner and a tracker and all of that. And so these people started to approach me based on those stories and said, hey, do you want to do this TV show? And some of them were absolutely terrible. I remember one of them made it to air, and Discovery's going to get mad when they hear this, but I don't care. It was called Man versus Bear. And they asked me if I wanted to host Man versus Bear, which was about people competing with bears in athletic arenas. And I was like, no, I'm not doing that. That's a terrible, that's just animal
exploitation,
extortion. And, I'm just not doing it. And so instead I started to write my own TV shows. And the one that I was the most excited about, granted, it actually was the idea that came from my partner, Patrick DeLuca, but still the one I was the most excited about was this idea of extinct or alive, which was, hey, every now and then animals pop up that people have declared extinct. And a perfect example was the Lord Howe stick insect, which was one that was making the news rounds about when we started to pitch the show. And, news rounds in very small circles. And, so to answer your question, when I first put this together and I came up with this list of animals that I believe had been wrongfully deemed extinct and so on and so forth, everybody in the scientific community in which I was in as a biologist was like, you're a lunatic, you're a tinfoil hat guy, like you should be chasing Bigfoot. And said how preposterous and stupid it was to be looking for extinct animals, because extinct doesn't mean, hiding. Extinct means eradicated. And so, it was very, very laughed at and frowned upon when we started. And then we became successful. On the end of our first season, we uncovered a leopard. And then moving into our second season, we uncovered 7 more species that had previously been deemed extinct between that and our Shark Week shows. And it spurred this whole industry of people looking for lost animals. And, all of a sudden the same critics who had been like, you're a lunatic, were now like, hey, tell me how you did that again. And, it had just sort of created this whole thing. And so that's what Extinct or Alive was. And it was a marriage of my skill sets and my background of being a tracker, being a wildlife biologist, growing up in Africa, having these survival skills, putting together an incredible team of amazing outdoor adventurers and cameramen, and gathering tons of local info. Growing up in Zimbabwe, I knew how to speak with local people, traditional tribal people, because Zimbabwe is a very tribal culture, the Shona are. And so all these things just sort of perfectly aligned to allow me to get into this information and go a lot further and harder than other people had been going to look for these things. And and we were successful, and the show was very successful.
I assume it's a lot of hey, go to this really remote village and talk to this guy because he hunts a lot and he's probably the last person who saw the animal and can kind of tell you where it was 3 years ago or 10 years ago. Now, man, some of these animals are crazy dangerous. I think you're talking about toxic snakes that can kill you, obviously venomous or lethal animals. And some of the snakes, what do you call them, 100 pacers, because you walk 100 paces and then you're dead. After you get bitten, you walk 100 paces and you just collapse.
Yep. Yeah, that's the 100 pacer. That's a Taiwanese snake. Very beautiful, very dangerous.
Crazy. Yeah. Does your team get sick or injured in any of these locations? Because you're in some random places, right? Zanzibar, different jungles in Tasmania. One of my friends is from Tasmania. I'm sure there are more wild places than where she gets her friggin' oat milk lattes or whatever. Shout out to my homegirls, Sal Kaching. But like Burma, Myanmar, right? These are places where if you get bit by something on the leg in the middle of the jungle, you can't just maybe call the army to have you lifted to a state-of-the-art medical facility.
Yeah, no, I mean, do we get sick sometimes? No, we don't get sick sometimes. We get sick every single time without fail.
Damn.
I think the only ones we haven't ever had a major calamity have been the Shark Week ones, where we're basically staying on a nice boat or in a hotel because we're doing Shark Week. But all of these tough expeditions, whether it's human wildlife conflict for my show Mysterious Creatures or the Extinct or Alive stuff. I mean, we've had guys faint, we've broken bones, we've had people pass out from heat stroke. We had something run through the crew in Madagascar where I won't get into the details, but everybody had stuff coming out both ends all night, every night.
Oh, man.
And, you know, it was just brutal, but we've had it all. And, you know, we travel with a medic that's part of our team. And he's great when he's himself is not the one in the fetal position, you know, and he's fantastic. But yeah, if you're bitten by a 100 pacer or you're tagged by a mamba or a shark rips off your arm, it doesn't matter who your medic is, you're done. You know, a lot of these instances were 3 or 4 days from civilization, not 3 or 4 hours. There's no airlift. We're further in than choppers can go. You know, we don't have comms until Garmin came out with the InReach, which is this little device that we use to send messages. You know, yeah, we had sat phones that we never knew how to work, or we were under jungle canopies where the signal never went out. And, yeah, it was just go in there and don't die and do your job. And, you know, that might sound like shocking or harrowing to a lot of people, but honestly, it's just, that's what I'd grown up doing. That's what safari people do every day, all day. And, you know, if you think back to not even that long ago, Jordan, you think back to 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that's all people did, right? Go in there, do your job, get into the bush, go find the thing, go build the thing, whatever it is, and don't die. And it's only this like sort of recent construct of like safety everything, and you got to be in communication, and you got to have this and this backup and that backup and this medication. And I get it, like nobody wants to die, but it's sort of a recent, you know, panicky construct that we've come up with for all of the safety stuff. Up in human history, that's never really been a thing until recently. And so, yeah, it didn't really bug me. It's how I grew up. We went through a lot of crew members, you know, early on in the show, as you can imagine. Like,
Yeah.
you know, we hired a bunch of guys from like LA studios that had filmed bullshit things like, sorry, I'm swearing, but like things like
That's all good.
things like Deadliest Catch, and they thought they were hard, you know, because they hung out on a boat in Alaska for a few
I
weeks.
got wet and cold so many times. Like, okay,
Right, totally.
you're
And
gonna
like,
pray you're wet and cold. On my
totally.
trip.
And you know, you hear their big egos. It's kind of like the naked and afraid tough guys, right? You hear their big egos and their talk about, oh, I did Deadliest Catch, I was on the boat for 3 months and blah blah. And you're like, cool, all right, that's great. Like, we're gonna hike for the next 3 days to get to our location with your shit on your back. Don't die, you know. And they're all quitting on like day 2. Like, I can't work under these conditions. And you know, where's the crafty, you know, where's the food services? And we're like, what food services? You know, like, what the fuck are you talking
Feel
about?
free to eat one of these parasitic wasps that keeps landing on you. They're
Exactly.
edible if you peel the stinger off.
Exactly. Yeah. So we lost a lot of people early on. And it's funny because my crew, who is my core crew, and I've had them since about halfway through the first season of the first show I ever did, are all guys that are exactly my age. They're all 1 year younger than me or my age. It's a group of 8 of us total. And they're all young guys from different backgrounds. Some are from scientific backgrounds. Some are from camera backgrounds. One guy has a doctorate in environmental science, you know, but they just all wanted to do these tough expeditions and wildlife work. And most of them picked up a camera as a means to do more wildlife stuff, not the other way around. They didn't go to film school because they were like in love with film and decided to, like, they liked animals later in life. And yeah, I've been with the same guys forever. And like one of them, for instance, like Johnny Harrington, my buddy Johnny, the first time we ever worked together, we did a 10-day shoot in Mexico, and I gave him a free used wetsuit for that shoot. That was what he got out of it. 10 days, he got a used wetsuit out of it. Now he's the director of photography for Shark Week, you know.
Wow.
So he's come a little way since working for a free wetsuit. So, you know, and they're sort of all like that. Like, these guys are incredibly accomplished. They're headhunted by tons of people to go work for them because not a lot of people can do what these guys do and carry a camera and make it look good and all of that stuff. So yeah, I'm very, very blessed to have such a good crew.
Yeah, look, man, these guys are really, you can tell they're doing it for the love of, they love everything that they're doing. You'd have to. I mean, you're going to places like Burma, Myanmar, right? And you're bringing drones to film, flying by the seat of your pants, no pun intended. And later you find out bringing a drone into Myanmar is a crime punishable by life in prison. Not a fine, not jail time, literally life in prison because it's an authoritarian military junta, right? So well, I guess it sort of is a death sentence because you're only going to live a few months before you die of preventable disease in a Burmese jail.
Correct. Yeah, that was terrifying, that whole thing. So we smuggled that drone in to get into Myanmar without knowing it because we landed right after the Rohingya massacre had occurred, and the journalists that had documented that with drone had been sentenced to life in prison. And our fixer was like, hide the drones. And we're like, okay. So we hid the drones, got in, and then found out we had been caught on CCTV, and that basically their TSA, whatever it was, their customs and their police force were like, come and turn yourselves in. And so we went through this crazy rigmarole, ditching the drones, throwing them in the swamp. We had a runner come in and get the footage at a stoplight, like hand-to-hand drop-off out of the car window so that they didn't see our footage. And it was just, honestly, it was an absolute miracle the way things worked out. When we went to the airport, the power was out and the systems were down, and they had to hand check us in Myanmar. And fortunately, our names didn't pop up. So we went in 3 groups. And the second we sat on the plane, like, I remember 2 of our guys actually started crying because they were so happy we weren't going to prison. And, I was just slamming gin and tonics because I was just like, I don't know how this is going to go. I mean, it was crazy, man. It was like something out of a movie. And when you're living through it, you don't really think about it. You're just like, stay focused, stay calm, get through this, like talk to these people. Like, okay, Eddie's over there with that group. Mitch is over there with that group. Like, you two come with me. We're going to check in at different desks, like try and be all low key. And yeah, sure enough, we made it out, and they never sort of pinned us for the whole drone thing, which was a miracle. Sadly, I don't know if I've ever shared this before, but our fixer got arrested the next day after we flew out. When the systems came back up, they showed up at his house and they threw him in jail overnight, or I think it was 2 nights actually, but they couldn't keep him because he didn't have any footage, he didn't have any drone, and he wasn't on the CCTV. They knew who he was because he had been with us, but by some miracle, the CCTV had been before customs, so he wasn't on the CCTV. He didn't have a drone. He didn't have any footage. There was no photographic evidence of him with us. They had absolutely nothing on him. So he spent a couple days in prison, apparently getting it pretty rough. Like, I don't know if it was quite all the way to torture, but they were definitely, definitely interrogating him very hard. And then they had to let him go because they had no evidence or proof at all. And I won't be going back to Myanmar anytime soon.
Yeah, no kidding. I would not do that. And I don't even, man, he must have just been like, I didn't see the drones. They didn't use the drones. They must have given the drones away before I got there.
Yeah. Apparently he just kept saying no drones. Like, that's it. No matter what they did, he just said no drones, and then they let him out.
Well, hopefully they don't bother listening to this podcast, I suppose.
No, I haven't given any names or anything, so I think we're okay. But
this is a fictional story. We never went to Burma.
Nope, don't even know where that is.
I mean, some of the places that you explore really are bananas. Some of the scenes. Tell me about the Crocs in Burma that ate all the Japanese soldiers in World War II. This story is freaking crazy, man.
Yeah, so the Ramree Island, it really is unbelievable, and it's like one of these great stories that hasn't been told enough. So the Ramree Island massacre took place in a place called Ramree Island, Myanmar, during World War II, and what it was the Japanese soldiers held Ramree Island against the Allies. And, it was a pivotal military point, a pivotal base for them in Southeast Asia. And at some point in time, man, I made the show a long time ago. I'm blanking on some of the minutia details. But at some point in time, the Allies came in, invaded the Ramree Island military base, and led to the soldiers fleeing into the swamp. Now, before we go into what happened to those soldiers, these soldiers had been holding this island, the standalone island, for over a year, a couple years, I think. They had hunted all of the livestock and game on the island because there's nothing to do, and they needed fresh meat to eat, which is a typical story in World War II that often never gets told, by the way. But, they'd just gone out and shot all of the little deer and things on the island in order to get meat. And so all of the crocodiles in the area had nothing to eat. So for 2 years, which crocodiles are perfectly capable of doing, the crocs had gone into basically a state of torpor, which is like dormancy. And they had just gone to sleep around this island because there was no food and they were starving. Well, one night during World War II, the Allies invade and they send 1,000 Japanese soldiers fleeing into the swamps. Well, guess who woke up? Several dozen or 100 hungry saltwater crocodiles all woke up at the same time from the bombing and the massacre and the noise. And they killed 1,000 Japanese soldiers in the course of 2 days. So these crocodiles went into something that biologists call henhouse syndrome, which is where a fox gets into a henhouse and is so overwhelmed by the stimulation of that much prey and abundance that they just kill, even though they're only going to eat 1 or 2 chickens, and in this case, 1 or 2 soldiers. And so these Crocs just went into this maddened state of henhouse syndrome and took out, nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers. And barely anybody lived. And it's because these soldiers were running through the swamp trying to flee. And so, excuse me. So we went there to look at this, and we were the first Westerners that had been to Ramree Island, at least as far as we could tell, since World War II. So it was amazing. Like, all the kids came out and like touched our skin and touched our hair and had never seen Westerners before. And it was really cool, an amazing place to film. Hands down, the most difficult shoot I've ever done. I mean, even though we were staying in one place, we weren't trekking a long time. We were nipples deep in the swamp every day. It was boiling hot. It was leeches everywhere, bats everywhere. Everybody got sick. I think I got dysentery, but I'm still not really sure. It was brutal. And about a week into the shoot, our fixer, the same guy who got arrested, comes like running in, and we're staying right next to a village in this little like research station, like abandoned research station. And he comes running in and he's like, there's a boy from the village. There's a boy from the village. He's dying. We go over there and he'd been attacked by one of these crocodiles while we were there. And, I'll try and keep a long graphic story short, but we rush over there. In between college and biology, when I was still trying to figure out what I was doing, I got a bunch of certifications, one of them being my emergency medical technician certification. Plus we had our medic, who I've mentioned before. And so the two of us worked feverishly to try and save this boy's life. And the croc had bitten him on the leg, bitten him on the thigh, right by his femoral artery, but he hadn't severed it, so he wasn't bleeding out there. But then he had let go of that, bitten on the boy's arm, and done a death roll. And the arm was just jello. He'd broken it in 25, 30 places. But then the lacerations were really bad too. And so we stabilized the arm, stabilized the wounds, blah, blah, blah. And thank God, because all they had in that area was canoes. So it was probably a 2 or 3 day canoe ride from the village to the nearest town. But we had a speedboat that had gotten us in and out of there. So we put the kid on the speedboat, and, in the calamity, I was like, just go. I don't care what it costs, blah, blah, because they started haggling about price for the speedboat. I was like, I don't give a shit, go. And they rushed the kid to the hospital after we stabilized him, and he lost the arm, but he did survive.
Wow. That's incredible. And should you be nipples deep in a swamp that has saltwater crocodiles, or are they not in that area of the swamp?
No, we should not have been. We shaped up a lot after that. So we were there. We had barely seen any. We'd seen crocodiles, but few of them, because a lot of them have been hunted and stuff like that. And so we were sort of very lackadaisical about safety, and we were like in the mud right next to the water, and tossing cameras to each other and trekking around and filming and all this stuff. And then this kid got munched, and we shaped up a lot. We were like, no more being in the water, no more being in the mud. We were just lucky that nothing had happened in the 10 days or so leading up to that to any of us. And sadly, it happened to this kid who was fishing, on sort of a different part of the swamp, but irrelevant. It could have been any one of us.
And he knew those Crocs were there too, because he's from there. So it seems like you guys just got really lucky that it wasn't one of you.
We got really lucky. He was also fishing, right? And so he had, fish blood in the water and stuff like that, and nets in the water. And so he was sort of leaving a bigger footprint, but it could happen to anybody at any time, anywhere. And that's the thing about crocodiles. It doesn't matter if it's Nile crocodiles, saltwater crocodiles. It just takes one to decide that they're going to come and chow, and there's not much you can do about it, especially in these murky, muddy swamps. So we were being dumb, and I say that outright in hindsight, like we were being dumb with the way we were behaving around that swamp, because we weren't seeing a lot of crocodiles. And then, this whole thing happened, and we're like, holy crap, we need to be a lot more aware of what we're doing.
Can you imagine being one of those Japanese soldiers? You're running, and you're like, wait, where are these other guys? And you just see parts of them floating around, and you're like, holy shit, that guy got...
Imagine the screams, just like, ah! And it's dark. This has all happened at night, by the way.
Oh,
like, it's dark. You're running through a swamp. You don't know if the allies are right behind you with guns. All of a sudden, something grabs you by the waist or the hip, and you don't really know what it is. You can't see it. You can't fight it off. Yeah, it would have been unbelievably insane.
It's like a horror movie, and then just you're regrouping, but there's less and less and less, and then somebody gets you. It's like Jaws, but there's 1,000 crocodiles. Right? Say like you're just getting sucked under the water suddenly. Oh my God.
It's a lot scarier than Jaws. Anybody can deal with one white shark. This is a lot scarier than Jaws.
Right. Yeah. No kidding. Oh my gosh. It's so scary. And look, I know that this is like they were on the wrong side of World War II, but like these are still
Who cares?
humans.
These are people.
Yeah. They're still humans.
Yeah. These are people with families, and it doesn't matter what side you were on. It was
Exactly.
brutal for them. Yeah.
Exactly. So did you end up finding I know you were looking for one specific crocodile, right?
We were looking for a croc that the locals dubbed White Nose, who's the same croc that hit the boy, apparently. When we didn't see it, but that we were told it was. And he was massive. And the reason we were looking for him is he would have been around during World War II and likely one of the culprits of...
Wow, crocs live that long, eh?
They do, yeah. So he likely ate a bunch of people during World War II and during the Ramree Island massacre. And so, and we did end up catching him the second to last day. We caught White Nose and took a tissue sample from him and carbon dated it and stuff like that. And I wasn't on camera for any of this, by the way. This was for a History Channel show that I produced called Face the Beast. That was a lot of fun. A famous wildlife lunatic like myself named Andrew Eucles was the host of it. And it was a fantastic show. But yeah, I was just there to produce it and help put it together. But crazy stuff.
Crazy. That croc probably still has epaulets in his stomach. If he ate it.
Seriously. Yeah.
That's freaking nuts. So what did you do? You just took a tissue sample and you're like, all right, go back in the water and maybe try not to kill villagers.
We moved him, and the locals did not want to kill him or anything, which was good because we thought it was going to be pretty sensitive, especially when we actually finally got him. We're like, this isn't going to go well. Like, they're just going to want to murder this croc because he's chowed a bunch of people. And it was interesting because the Myanmar people that we were with, I don't remember the specific group, but they didn't feel that way. They were just like, this is what crocodiles do. Like, please just take him away. And so we did. We moved him and let him go.
That's really interesting. They really they know their place in the ecosystem, I guess, in the food chain, and they just have a reverence for the animal.
It was very surprising, to be honest, because I growing up in Zimbabwe and having, I even posted a croc that I caught today actually on my Instagram, but like they would much rather, for the most part, want to kill the crocodiles, and so
sure.
I don't know what it was about this particular group in Myanmar that felt this way, but yeah, they didn't want to kill it, which, we weren't going to kill it either way, right? That was out, but it's like we either catch it and let it go and say nothing, or, which was not really an option because we were working with these local people, but I was certainly never going to allow that crocodile to be killed, and so it was, I thought it was going to be much more delicate, and it wasn't. They were like, no, you don't need to kill it. It's just a crocodile being a crocodile, which was amazing that they had that awareness.
Was that the most dangerous place you've been to in terms of wildlife? I mean, the government aside, of course, that makes it even more dangerous, but in terms of wildlife, would you say that Burma's the most dangerous, or is it a crapshoot? Not even close?
Not even close. No. I mean, that was dangerous just because of that particular individual crocodile. But anytime you're working in, there's nowhere that, granted, I haven't worked much around polar bears, and I've heard they can be pretty tricky. But, there's nowhere like dealing with the Zambezi Delta in Southern Africa, Mozambique, parts of Zimbabwe. We're just like, you got to watch your step at every point. And so that's by far the most dangerous when it comes to the wildlife.
What's the scariest animal you've encountered? Because I hear a lot about, we hear a lot about hippos, but I'm like, is that basic bitches only compared to what you've seen on your adventures?
No, not at all. Hippos are terrible. I've had two very, very close calls to losing my life with hippos, and they're unpredictable. They're a very nervous animal. I would never call a hippo an aggressive animal, which is a mistake that I think a lot of people make. They're not.
That's what you hear.
And they're not aggressive. They're nervous. They're a very nervy animal, and they get startled quickly. And they don't have a fight or flight reflex. They have a fight reflex. So when they're startled, they go into fight mode. They don't have a flight mode. And so, that's the deal with hippos. And if they can't sink underwater and feel comfortable, they're very, very on edge. And couple that with like bad eyesight and this, that, and the other thing, and they're very, very dangerous. And yeah, I've had a canoe flipped over and I've had one charge me, and both times, nothing really bad happened, but it was very, very close. And they're between the hippo and the Cape buffalo. There's nothing else more dangerous. Lions and all these predators and all these things our Aussie friends talk about don't even compare to Cape buffalo and hippo. They're by far the scariest. Oh yeah.
Are they fast? Are hippos fast? They look like they could be like low key fast.
Oh yeah, no, I'd have to look it up, but they're very fast. I think they're like 25 miles an hour on land.
Wow, that's ridiculous. I had no idea because they look like fat lops of. They're just like
19. 19 miles an hour.
That's
I was
fast.
a little off, but
That's
it's
really
fast. Yeah.
Because they look just like chubby little vegetarian water. Like you kind of look at them and a manatee, and you're like, they're kind of similar, right?
Yeah. Word
But not at all.
hippopotamus means water horse, right? It's like
Yeah,
it's looked
right,
at as meaning as this like gentle, blubbery, sweet little thing, but no, they're really not. If anybody listening to this, if you want to see something incredible, just look up like 2 male hippos fighting for territory, and you'll understand. Like it's not much. Like it's their tusks, their size, their strength. I mean, they're crazy things.
I didn't realize they had tusks. Because I guess when you look at them in a zoo, do they take the tusks off?
Well, no, tusks, like they're molars. They're growing teeth.
Oh, those
right?
big ass teeth. Yeah, so, I mean, if you think about it, they live in the water with crocodiles and stuff, and they're doing fine. So if the crocs are staying away from them, they're probably pretty
Exactly
intimidating.
right. Yeah, no, they coexist with Nile crocodiles, which are much tougher and meaner than saltwater crocodiles because they eat land animals constantly. That's what they eat is herbivores, right? And saltwater crocodiles, don't get me wrong, they'll kill a person. They can be terrible, but they're primarily fish eaters. So hippos have to live in a space where they have large crocodiles that prey on animals like them constantly. And so if they don't have that ability to defend themselves and their babies, their offspring, they're gone. So yeah, no, they're crazy.
So do you have to escape, or can you scare it away somehow? What do you do when you get attacked by a hippopotamus?
Well, I wouldn't say I've ever been attacked because I don't really know what that would entail. But, I've been charged by this one that came out of this pan, and another time I had a canoe flipped over. And, both times there's no stand your ground. Certain animals, like an elephant mock charges, you stand your ground. You put your hand up, you say, whoa, whoa, whoa. You don't turn and run, right? A lot of predatory animals, you do not turn your back and run, right? That's the worst thing you can do. You stand your ground. There's no standing your ground with a hippo. If a hippo's coming at you, you go. And so the best thing you can do, they're not as maneuverable as a human. So they'll beat you in a straight line. But if you can duck behind a big, baobab tree, masasa tree, or behind a termite mound, or get up something, then I guess that's the best you can do. But that's, it's like so situational, right? Are you on land? Are you in a canoe? Like, it's just like, I'm not going to sit here and tell people how to avoid a hippo because there isn't really a way. Just don't get that bloody close is the answer.
Dang. Have you ever had to put an animal down? Like, are you ever getting something so close to you and you have to shoot it or cut it or whatever?
I very rarely carry a gun. Pretty much the only time I carry a gun is when I've been around bears. I've carried a gun a few times, and then walking through the bush in Africa, I've carried a sidearm. Just, basically they're just noise-making machines. But it is situational. I've never had to put down an animal. I fired a weapon a few times, but like when we were in Zimbabwe the last time I was filming there, we were darting lions, and we went for a walk one morning.
Darting lions? Is that like tagging an animal or
putting collars on them? Yeah. So shoot
okay.
them with a tranquilizer, put them to sleep, put a collar on them. It's also very dangerous work. But
I bet.
we were on foot tracking through the bush, and we had a pretty rough standoff with a black rhino. And in hindsight, my cameraman Mitch, he said to me, he's like, "Well, you had that gun, you never even took it out." And I said to him, and I mean this, I was like, think how many people there are in this world. 8 billion, right? How many rhinos are there left? I was like, there's nothing that would have made me pull that gun out. I would much rather that rhino kill me when I'm putting myself in that situation than I kill it because I've come into its house and startled it, and I mean that. Now, different situations with different creatures, but there's not a lot of situations in which I just shoot something in the head because it charged me after I was the one that was in its home.
Yeah, that makes sense. And black rhinos, are rhinos similar in temperament to hippopotami?
No, they're not. So they have awful eyesight and very good sense of smell. So what happens in the bush sometimes is you're downwind of them and you pop up on them and they get startled. And, like most things in the African bush, they'll defend themselves when they're startled because that is much better than running away. And so, yeah, they don't have a similar temperament at all. They're not assertive or, they're not trying to fight because 99% of the time you would never be able to walk up on a rhino. They'll smell you and take off. They just don't want to have anything to do with you. But if they feel startled or cornered, they're going to turn and charge. Whereas a hippo, they feel startled immediately and they're coming at you as quick as they can, basically, in the right situation.
I would imagine the actual most dangerous creature is like a mosquito, just in terms
Oh,
of
of
how many
course.
people it's killed, right?
Of course, yeah. And fatalities, yeah, mosquito. I mean, you can Google that all day long. By far, the most dangerous animal is a mosquito in the world.
It's like hundreds of millions of deaths over however long they've been counting mosquito deaths. It's like hundreds or maybe more.
Oh,
if
yeah.
if you extrapolate like through time. Just
And your
crazy.
likelihood of being killed by any of the things we're talking about, it's much sexier to talk about a shark bite or a hippo attack, but your likelihood of being killed by them is astronomically small, and your likelihood of getting malaria and dying is pretty damn high when you're in the right region. So, it's not even close.
Mosquitoes kill 700,000 to 800,000 people per year. So if you just do that for a few thousand years, right? Because I assume that's been constant. That's how deadly they are. My friend Justin Wren, who you may know just through different circles, he's a fighter. He goes to Africa, deals with pygmies. He's had malaria a bunch of times, and he's a really tough guy. And he's like, it's the worst. It's worst.
Brutal. Yeah, it's brutal. I've seen it. I fortunately haven't had it that I'm aware of, and it's brutal. I've seen it. I saw my grandpa get it. I've seen a lot of people get it. It's awful. And it's funny because it's very avoidable. You don't need to take Malarone and those horrible things. I can't stand those drugs. All you have to do, at least in Africa, is cover up at night, wear long sleeves. That's all you have to do. It's very, very simple. But yeah, it's brutal.
Man, there's so much more that I want to ask you. I'm going to have you come back. I know you got a meeting coming up, so I'm going to let you go. But thank you very much for coming on, man. This stuff is fascinating. And again, I think we have I've got like a whole nother show's worth of notes. So when you get back from your next jaunt, we'll have to. Where are you going next?
So I take off for Africa next week. I'll be in South Africa filming some endemic shark species there for 3 weeks. And then I have a couple days off. I'm going to visit some friends. And then I'm heading straight to probably the number one bucket list place for me right now, which is Nigaloo Reef in Western Australia, to look at the relationship between tiger sharks and sea snakes and measure sea snake venom toxicity. So then I'll be there until April.
Wow.
So yeah,
do you have to
be
catch
fun.
the snakes to measure yeah.
Certainly. Yeah. Catch them and milk them.
Man.
Yep.
You got to catch a sea snake and milk it. I'm sure that doesn't sound like something they enjoy either.
Yeah, they don't, to be honest. But if you don't do these studies, then we don't learn about the effects of the venom and so on and so forth. And it'll be great. It'll be a lot of fun, great adventure. Pretty harmless to take a little venom from a snake and throw it back in the water. So harmless to them anyway. Let's just hope none of us get a scratch.
That's right. Hey, sometimes you just got to milk a snake, and I think that's the lesson we're going to take with us from this episode into the rest of the week. Forrest, thank you so much, man.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.